Hello, good afternoon. This is day 385, I believe. 84 or 85. And we're just going to be wrapping up chapter 3 of A People's History of the United States. I believe we left off on page 51. Yeah, okay. Chapter 3, A People's History of the United States. Chapter 3, Persons of Mean and Vile Condition. Page 51. I think hold on. Did I turn the audio off? No, I didn't. Okay. I think the audio should be good. 8 years after the bread riot on the Common, a pamphleteer protested against how those who became rich by grinding the poor, by studying how to oppress, cheat, and overreach their neighbors. He denounced the rich, great, and potent, who rapish violence bear down all before them. In the 1730s in Boston, people protesting the high prices established by merchants demolished the public market in Dock Square, while a conservative writer complained, murmuring against the government and the rich people. No one was arrested, after the demonstrators warned that arrest would bring 500 men in solemn league and covenant, who would destroy other markets set up for the benefit of rich merchants. Okay. Don't sound like a bad protest. Around the same time, in New York, an election pamphlet urged New York voters to vote Shuttle the weaver, Plane the joiner, Drive the carter, Mortar the mason, Tar the mariner, Snip the tailor, Small Rent the fair-minded landlord, and John Poor the tenant, against Gripe the merchant, Squeeze the shopkeeper, Spintex, and Quibble for lawyer. The electorate was urged to vote out of office people in exalted stations who scorned those who call the vulgar, the mob, the herd of mechanics. In the 1730s, a committee of the Boston Town Meeting spoke out for Bostonians in debt, who wanted paper money issued to make it easier to pay off their debts to the merchant elite. They did not want, they declared, to have our bread and water measured out to us by those who riot in luxury and wantonness on our sweat and toil. Bostonians also rioted against imprisonment in which men were drafted for naval service. They surrounded the house of the governor, beat up the sheriff, locked up a deputy sheriff, and stormed the townhouse where the general court sat. Oh, this shit is crazy. The militia did not respond when called to put them down, and the governor fled. The crowd was condemned by a merchants group as a righteous, tumultuous assembly of foreign seamen, servants, let me see, how do I want to say this? The other N-word, and other persons of mean and vile condition. So going with the old Tom McNamara excuse, it was people from out of town. It was people from out of town that caused damage to property on May 30th. It was people out of town that was looting and rioting. In New Jersey in the 1740s and 1750s, poor farmers occupying land over which they and the landowners had rival claims rioted when rents were demanded of them. In 1745, Samuel Baldwin, who had long lived on his land and held the Indian title to it, was arrested for non-payment of a rent to the proprietor and taken to the Newark jail. The contemporary described what happened then. The people in general, supposing the design of the proprietors was to ruin them, went to the prison, opened the door, and took out Baldwin. When two men who freed Baldwin were arrested, hundreds of New Jersey citizens gathered around the jail. A report sent by the New Jersey government to the Lords of the Table in London described the scene. Two of the new captains of the Newark companies, by the sheriff's order, went with their drums to the people, so met and required all persons there belonged to their companies to follow the drums and to defend the prison. But none followed, though many were there. The multitude between 4 and 5 of the clock in the afternoon lighted off their horses and came toward the goal, huzzing and swinging their clubs, till they came within reach of the guard, struck them with their clubs, and the guard, having no orders to fire, returned the blows with their guns, and some were wounded on both sides, but none were killed. The multitude broke the rank of the soldiers and pressed on the prison door, where the sheriff stood with a sword and kept them off, till they gave them several blows and forced him out from thence. They then, with axes and other instruments, broke open the prison door and took out the two prisoners, as also one other prisoner that was confined for debt, and went away. Through this period, England was fighting a series of wars. Queen Anne's War in the early 1700s, King George's War in the early 1730s. Some merchants made fortunes from these wars, but for most people, they meant higher taxes, unemployment, and poverty. An anonymous pamphleteer in Massachusetts, writing angrily after King George's War, described the situation. Poverty and discontent appear in every face except the countenance of the rich, and dwell upon every tongue. He spoke of a few men fed by lust of power, lust of fame, lust of money, who got rich during the war. No wonder such men can build ships, houses, buy farms, set up their coaches, live very splendidly, purchase fame, posts of honor. He called them birds of prey, enemies to all communities wherever they live. The Fourth Service of Seamen led to a riot against imprisonment in Boston in 1747. The crowds turned against Thomas Hutchinson, a rich merchant and colonial official who had backed the governor in putting down the riot. And who also designed a currency plan for Massachusetts, which seemed to discriminate against the poor. Hutchinson's house burned down mysteriously, and a crowd gathered in the street, cursing Hutchinson and shouting, "Let it burn." That's nuts. By the years of the Revolutionary crisis, the 1760s, the wealthy elite that controlled the British colonies on the American mainland, had 150 years of experience, had learned certain things about how to rule. They had various fears, but also had developed tactics to deal with what they feared. The Indians they had found were too unruly to keep as a labor force, and remained an obstacle to expansion. Black slaves were easier to, that's what the book say. Black slaves were easier to control, and the profitability for southern plantations was bringing in an enormous increase in the importation of slaves, who were becoming a majority in some colonies, constituted 1/5 of the entire colonial population. But the Africans were not totally submissive, and as their numbers grew, the prospect of slave rebellion grew. With the problem of Indian hostility and the danger of slave revolts, the colonial elite had to consider the class anger of poor whites, servants, tenants, the city poor, the property-less, the taxpayer, the soldier and sailor. As the colonies passed their 100th year and went into the middle of the 1700s, as the gap between rich and poor widened, as violence and the threat of violence increased, the problem of control became more serious. What if these different despised groups, the Indians, the slaves, the poor whites, should combine? Even before there were so many Africans in the 17th century, there was, as Abbott Smith puts it, a lively fear that servants would join with the Africans or Indians to overcome the small number of masters. There was little chance that whites and Indians would combine in North America as they were doing in South and Central America, where the shortage of women and the use of Indians on the plantations led to daily contact. Only in Georgia and South Carolina, where white women were scarce, was there some sexual mixing of white men and Indian women. In general, the Indian had been pushed out of sight, out of touch, out of sight, out of mind. One fact disturbed, whites would run off to join Indian tribes or would be captured in battle and brought up among the Indians. And when this would happen to the whites, given a chance to leave, chose to stay in the Indian culture. Indians, having the choice, almost never decided to join the whites. Hector St. John Crevecoeur, I have no idea. The Frenchman who lived in America for almost 20 years told in letters from an American farmer how children captured during the 7 Years' War and found by their parents growing up and living with Indians would refuse to leave their new families. There must be in their social bond, he said, something singularly captivating and far superior to anything to be boasted among us. For thousands of Europeans are Indians, and we have no examples of even one of those Aborigines having from choice become Europeans. But this affected few people. In general, the Indian was kept at a distance, and the colonial officialdom had found a way of alleviating the danger by monopolizing the good land on the eastern seaboard. They forced landless whites to move westward to the frontier, there to encounter the Indians and to be a buffer for the seaboard, rich against Indian troubles, while becoming more dependent on the government for protection. Bacon's rebellion was instructive to consolidate a diminishing Indian population at the expense of infuriating a coalition of white frontiersmen was very risky. Better to make war on the Indian, gain the support of white, divert possible class conflict by turning poor whites against Indians for the security of the elite. black people and Indians combined against the white enemy. In the northern colonies, except on Cape Cod, Martha's Vineyard, and Rhode Island, where there was close contact and sexual mixing, there was not much opportunity for Africans and Indians to meet in large numbers. New York had the largest slave population in the North, and there was some contact between black people and Indians, as in 1712, when Africans and Indians joined together in an insurrection. But this was quickly suppressed. In the Carolinas, however, whites were outnumbered by black slaves and nearby Indian tribes. In the 1750s, 25,000 whites faced 40,000 black slaves, with 60,000 Creek, Cherokee, Choctaw, and Chickasaw Indians in the area. Gary Nash writes, Indian uprisings that punctuated the colonial period and the succession of slave uprisings and insurrectionary plots that were nipped in the bud kept South Carolinians sickeningly aware that only through their greatest vigilance, that through policies designed to keep their enemies divided, could they hope to remain in control of the situation. The white rulers of the Carolinas seemed to be conscious of the need for a policy, as one of them put it, to make Indians and Africans a check upon each other, lest by the vastly superior numbers we should be crushed by one or the other. And so laws were passed prohibiting free Africans from traveling in Indian country. Treaties with Indian countries contain clauses requiring the return of fugitive slaves. Governor Littleton of South Carolina wrote in 1738, "It has always been the policy of this government to create an aversion in them Indians to Africans." Part of this policy involved using black slaves in the South Carolina militia to kill Indians. Still, the government was worried about black revolt, and during the Cherokee War in the 1760s, a motion to equip 500 slaves to fight the Indians lost in the Carolina Assembly by a single vote. Africans ran away to Indian villages, and the Creeks and Cherokees harbored runaway slaves by the hundreds. Many of these were amalgamated into Indian tribes, married and produced children. With a combination of harsh slave codes and bribes to the Indians to help put down black rebels, kept things under control. It was a potential combination of poor whites and Africans that caused the most fear among the wealth of white planters. If there had been the natural racial repugnance, by some theorists have assumed, control would have been easier. But sexual attraction was powerful across racial. But sexual attraction was powerful across racial lines. That's a nice thing to say. In 1743, a grand jury in Charleston, South Carolina, denounced the too common practice of criminal conversation with African and other slave wenches in this province. Mixed offspring continued to be produced by white-black sexual relations throughout the colonial period, in spite of laws prohibiting interracial marriage in Virginia, Massachusetts, Maryland, Delaware, Pennsylvania, the Carolinas, Georgia. Yeah, okay. My fault. By declaring the children illegitimate, they would keep them inside the black families so that the white population will remain pure and in control. What made Bacon's rebellion especially fearsome for the rulers of Virginia was that black slaves and white servants joined forces. The final surrender was by 400 English slaves, by 400 English and Africans in arms at one garrison, and 300 free men and African and the English bondservants in another garrison. The naval commander who subdued the 400 wrote, "Most of them I persuaded to go to their homes, which accordingly they did, except about 80 Africans and 20 English, which they would not deliver their arms." All through these early years, black and white slaves and servants ran away together, as shown by both the laws passed to stop this and the records of the courts. In 1698, South Carolina passed a deficiency law, requiring plantation owners to have at least one white servant for every 6 male adult Africans. A letter from the southern colonies in 1682 complained of no white men to superintend our Africans, or repress an insurrection of Africans. In 1691, the House of Commons received a petition of divers merchants, masters of ships, planters, and others trading to foreign plantations, setting forth that the plantations can't be maintained without a considerable number of white servants, as well as to keep the Africans in subjection, as to bear arms in case of invasion. A report to the English government in 1721 said that in South Carolina, black slaves have lately attempted and were nearly Black slaves have lately attempted and were very near succeeding in a new revolution, and therefore it may be necessary to propose some new law for encouraging the entertainment of more white servants in the future. The militia of this province does not consist of above 2,000 men, and apparently 2,000 were not considered sufficient to meet that threat. This fear may explain why Parliament in 1717 made transportation to the New World a legal punishment for crime. After that, tens of thousands of convicts could be sent to Virginia, Maryland, and other colonies. It also made understandable why the Virginia Assembly, after Bacon's rebellion, gave amnesty to white servants who had rebelled, but not to Africans. Africans were forbidden to carry any arms, while whites finishing their servitude would get muskets along with corn and cash. The distinction of status between white and black servants became more and more clear. In the 1720s, with fear of slave rebellion growing, white servants were allowed in Virginia to join the militia as substitutes for white freedmen. At the same time, slave patrols were established in Virginia to deal with the great dangers that may happen by the insurrection of Africans. Poor white men would make up the rank and file of these patrols and get their monetary reward. Racism was becoming more and more practical. Edmund Morgan, on the basis of his careful study of slavery in Virginia, sees racism not as natural, but to black and white difference, but something coming out of class scorn, a realistic device for control. If free men with disappointed hopes should make common cause with slaves of desperate hope, the results might be worse than anything Bacon had done. The answer to this problem, obvious if unspoken and only gradually realized, was racism. to separate dangerous whites from dangerous slaves by a screen of racial contempt. There was still another control which became handy as the colonies grew, and which had crucial consequences for the continued rule of the elite throughout American history. Along with the very rich and very poor, there developed a white middle class of small planters, independent farmers, city artisans who given small rewards for joining forces with merchants and planters, would be a solid buffer against black slaves, frontier Indians, and the very poor white. The growing cities generated more skilled workers, and the governments cultivated the support of white merchants by protecting them from the competition of both slaves and the free Africans. As early as 1686, the Council in New York ordered that no African or slave be suffered to work on the bridge as a porter about any goods either imported or exported from or into this city. In the southern towns, too, white craftsmen and traders were protected from African competition. In 1764, the South Carolina legislature prohibited Charleston masters from employing Africans or other slaves as mechanics or in handicraft trades. Middle-class Americans might be invented to join the new elite by a tax against the corruption of the established rich. The New Yorker Cadwallader Colden, in his address to the freeholders in 1747, attacked the wealthy as tax dodgers unconcerned with the welfare of others, although he himself was wealthy, and spoke for the honesty and dependability of the middling rank of mankind, in which citizens could best trust our liberty and property. This was to become a critically important rhetorical device for the rule of the few, who would speak to the many of our liberty, our property, our country. Similarly, in Boston, the rich James Otis could appeal to the Boston middle class by attacking the Tory Thomas Hutchinson. James Henrietta has shown that while it was the rich who ruled Boston, there were political jobs available for the moderately well-off, as colors of staves, measures of coal baskets, fence viewer. Aubrey Land found in Maryland a class of small planters who were not the beneficiary of the planting society as the rich were, but who had the distinction of being called planters, and who were respectable citizens with community obligations to act as overseers of roads, appraisers of estates, and similar duties. It helped the Alliance to accept the middle class socially in a round of activities that included local politics, dances, horse racing, and cockfights, occasionally punctuated with drinking brawls. The Pennsylvania Journal wrote in 1756, "The people of this province are generally of the middling sort, and at present pretty much upon a level. They are chiefly industrious farmers, artificers of men, or in trade. They enjoy and are fond of freedom, and the meanest among them, he thinks, has a right to civility from the greatest." Indeed, there was a substantial middle class fitting that description. To call them the people was to omit black slaves, white servants, and displaced Indians. In the term middle class was concealed a fact long true about this country, that, as Richard Hofstadter said, It was a middle-class society governed, for the most part, by its upper class. Those upper class to rule needed to make concessions to the middle class without damage to their wealth, to their own wealth or power, at the expense of slaves, Indians, and poor whites. This brought loyalty, and to bind that loyalty with something more powerful even than a material advantage, the ruling group found in the 1760s and 1770s a wonderfully useful device. That device was a language of liberty and equality, which could unite just enough whites to fight a revolution against England without enduring either slavery or inequality. Okay, and that brings us to the conclusion of chapter 3. Probably do another live. Hopefully do another live in the evening. And if not, tomorrow about chapter 4, which is titled Tyranny is Tyranny. Day 385, the struggle continues.